Okay, you can go ahead, Richard.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. This program examines a few of the doctrinal courses I teach and how I was able to incorporate experiential sessions that were not part of the original syllabus into them. Although the faculty prep work isn't immaterial, student reception of these types of classes makes it most worthwhile. So what is experiential learning? Well, Kent State has a webpage that summarizes experiential learning and why it's important. And as you can see from this slide, experiential learning provides students with a better understanding of course material, a broader view of the world, insight into their own skills or interests and values, opportunities to collaborate, positive skill sets, and self-confidence. Okay, so now that we have context, let's begin our discussion. So teachers of law, there's usually so much material to cover in our courses that we sometimes have trouble figuring out what to include and what to cut. So how can we incorporate experiential coursework into our courses with this backdrop? So the first thing I look at is my syllabus and to see how much time I devote to each topic in a given course. And after performing that exercise, the only way to incorporate experiential coursework into my courses is to grapple with some of the things we all do without experiential learning components. So this is namely the time constraints in teaching everything we want to, but may not be able to with the number of classroom hours that we have. So I ask myself, is everything so important? Or what can I teach my students that will provide the best exposure to the subject matter, but not to include every single component of the material? So what do I mean by that? I only teach real estate practical skills courses. So there's very little legal theory in my coursework. Furthermore, I often use actual transaction documents to teach my courses. So to illustrate this point, take an office lease, for example. There are probably 20 material provisions in an office lease that should be included in a commercial leasing course. But are all 20 deserving or needing a lot of instruction time? Of course, this is an easier job for someone who teaches what they do for a living as opposed to someone that's familiar with the doctrinal subject matter but has little work experience in it. But some due diligence on the professor's part will solve that. So I then focus on what's most negotiated in a document and use that basis to cull some instruction time. So using the example above, perhaps all 20 topics do not need more than, let's say, an hour each. So think about this being a 2-credit course. So assigning reading prior to class and then reinforcing what my students have read is how I do it. But let's look at the variables which we encounter that directly affect how much material we can actually cover in a class. Irrespective of the class size, how many questions we're asked when lecturing sometimes derails the amount of material we intend to cover, right? I mean, all of you face this. Classes differ in makeup and level, and this can be seen not only in comparing students at different schools, which I do, I teach at 4 different schools during the year, but within the same school from semester to semester. So because I teach at 3 different schools in the fall and 3 different ones in the spring, and only 1 during the summer, I encounter a lot of different student bodies. But within each school, the student body can be different from one semester to the next. And we as professors have to be nimble and flexible enough, the same way practicing attorneys do when they are relating to given transactions on which they're working. Another example of curveballs that affect the timing of imparting our material to our students is if there's new law that develops between or during semesters. So the example that I use, because it's really easy, is when I first started teaching sustainable building law in 2009, there was no case law. there was merely one case that was settled before trial. So there was no judicial reasoning available, and the time I devoted to green building litigation was no more than a half an hour. Now there are so many sustainable building law cases that I spend an entire session on green litigation, and I can only use representative cases to teach it. So think about that. Since I first taught the course, in order to cover case law in a meaningful way, I had to cut 1.5 hours of instruction in one subject to be able to devote it, obviously later on, which I do now, to litigation. So if sometimes there's an organic morphing of material that we cover, that we then have to add to our curriculum, if we want to include experiential sessions as part of those courses, we'll lose even more lecture time. But there's a way to solve this problem. And the way I do it, and the key that I use, is to look at two components of our coursework. The first has to do with the scope of material. Some of us rely on a text to set our syllabi. And in that case, we try to cover as much of the casebook as we can and rely on the author of that casebook to help us organize our material. However, and here we need to be careful, do we really need to have our students plow through an entire 750-page text for a 2-credit course? Probably not. But if we fail to utilize the majority of the book, our students may be annoyed that they've spent all that money on a book and are only spending a small portion reading it. So the second thing to think about is if we're going to truncate the material taught, we need to make sure that what's cut isn't foundational for our experiential class. And this is true when we prepare for our final exams as well. Next, I take a look at the experiential class itself and the time we will need to make that session worthwhile. So think about it. It's not only to the students that are participating in the role play, but also to the rest of the students in class. So how do I accomplish all of the above? And in the beginning, it wasn't easy. How about reducing the scope of the experiential session, or reducing the time devoted to each of those sessions? Or how about reducing the amount of material we teach in our lectures, which doesn't mean that the students will not learn that material, but perhaps some of it is from readings we assign before class. So the example that I use that makes sense to most other professors is I use practical guidance material from LexisNexis in my courses, similar to practical law in West. And that saves me time in providing background foundational material to my students before any of my classes. As you know, it's not an all or nothing strategy. The next thing to think about is, does class size matter? Well, yes and no. The courses which I teach that have 50 plus students don't easily lend themselves to having experiential learning for all students in the class. That's not going to happen. But it doesn't mean that the benefit of experiential learning has to be totally absent from the course. So for my very large classes, I can still include simulation sessions, but only for a limited number of students. So what do I mean by that? I ask for volunteers from the class, for those that wish to participate. And once I have the number of students that make sense, so in a large class, perhaps 2 sets of role plays will be enough. They'll be assigned their roles to prepare for the following class. And then when they negotiate or argue their positions during that following class, then they not only benefit themselves from this exercise, but then the other students in class do as well. They see what's involved in the process, and then we discuss after these sessions what was learned. The next thing I do when planning for experiential training is figuring out the timing of the role plays. And this has a 2-pronged analysis. How many students will be participating? So if I have 10 students in each 2-hour class, each pair of students will have roughly 20 minutes. But if I have 20 students, that cuts it to 10 minutes each. At some point, if the time allotted to these simulation sessions is limited, it doesn't make sense to have everyone participate. However, maybe it makes sense to expand the time of the experiential classes themselves. In my sustainable building law course, I began with only one experiential session, and now I have two. One is on mock arguments, and the other one is on a landlord-tenant negotiation session. And that's out of 13 classes. So I then only have 11 classes in which to teach. Well, although one could argue that I'm still teaching the experiential classes. And I would recommend that you do what I do because it adds to the class's experience, that although they're presenting, it doesn't stop me from interrupting them to sort of squeeze out a little bit extra teaching. So next on my list is how should students prepare for the sessions? So keep in mind, if they need the foundational information fully grasped in order to participate, which they do, if they don't have that, it's not going to be a benefit to anyone. So it's also a reason I plan for these sessions towards the end of the semester, as my students won't have enough under their belts to adequately participate otherwise. So for example, as I already mentioned, in my sustainable building law course with those two simulation sessions, because one is devoted to mock arguments for green building issues, I assign the role of a party to a given student, but I then leave it up to them to decide what causes of action they may wish to argue. The other session I've mentioned is a landlord-tenant negotiation session. And although I assign each party who they represent, whether it's a landlord or a tenant, and certain lease provisions I assign to them as well, I give them the option to add one or two provisions as well to that. In my condo co-op course, I have two simulation sessions. One is a contract negotiation session, and the other one is a mock board meeting, where I have two groups of students sit in front of the class, and one group acts as a condo board of managers, and the other one acts as a condo board of directors, both of them using real-life agendas for their meetings. It sort of gives them the opportunity, if they're going to be counsel to a condo or co-op board, what in fact they're going to encounter when they're sitting in on those meetings. The last thing to consider is, do I have the students meet each other before class or face each other cold? In most classes, I have them meet. So for instance, with mock arguments, I find that if they flesh out their individual roles and causes of action in advance, it not only benefits their experience, but also that of the rest of the class. However, for a landlord-tenant negotiation session, sometimes they have no idea who their adversary is until the class itself. Sort of like in real life, sometimes I have no idea who's on the other side until we're actually discussing the lease itself. So in that case, knowledge of the salient provisions that they're going to negotiate is most important. Lastly, how do I grade the sessions? So here I'm pretty liberal in my grading when it comes to the experiential sessions. I look more to how much each student has prepared for the class rather than the outcome of the negotiation or argument or meeting. Clearly if a student is prepared and not sitting there agreeing with their adversary on all points and has nothing to contribute to the session, that's not going to be a favorable grade. But for us to grade a student on an experiential session on what the outcome is, I think is difficult. It definitely would be difficult for me, much less a student that maybe is reluctant or reticent to appear in front of the class to begin with. So I try not to be too hard on my students when it comes to grading in that respect. And then I guess the final, recommendation I have for experiential sessions in my courses is, for many years, the response has pretty been consistent in every school at which I teach and have experiential components to my classes. My students tell me that they're the most fun part of the course and from which they learn a tremendous amount, because here they then have an opportunity to articulate, some of the subject matter that they learned during the course. And also, as I mentioned before, because during those experiential sessions, I'm asking questions. I'm putting them basically on the spot. I'm gleaning extra, learning time from my students. I warn them in advance that I'm going to be asking them questions. And just as an aside, if any of you ever clerked for judges, when I clerked for a judge, the judge, although not totally appropriate, asked witnesses questions in addition to the attorneys that were appearing before him. So I'm sort of acting like that judge sometimes and asking my students questions, because there may be some things that they're not asking each other that I want the other students in class to learn from. So that's basically how I get around doing that. So sort of as a recap, just to make sure we understand, at least my position in incorporating experiential sessions into my doctrinal courses. The first thing is figuring out how to come up with the time to do it, which isn't easy, and I give you that. There's a lot of material that we want to cover. But as I said before, there is material that we, at the outset of a course, expected to cover that we may not have time to cover because of the number of questions that were asked during the course. We always have that, we always have to balance that, because we want to make sure our students are learning the material that we're teaching to them. Sometimes we're relying on material that they're reading outside of class. Although I will tell you, for the classes that I teach that have final exams, I won't test them on the material I'm having them read unless I've covered it during my coursework. So although they get the background of reading the material in advance, I want to make sure that they understand in class what I'm teaching them. Then to pull together some of this in my experiential classes, that's how I, get the job done. I think that's how I get the job done. And as I mentioned, the evaluations that I get from my students at least attest to that. Maybe they should be given more credit than I'm taking for these experiential classes, because they're doing the work for those sessions. But I find, and they find, that they're learning a lot from that. Okay, I've tried to put everything that I have in my experiential classes and the prep for that into a nutshell, but I'm sort of expecting or hoping that there are a lot of questions that and whoever is in the room or virtually attending. So I open it up to questions. No questions?
Yeah, one.
So thank you. I noticed you talked about practical law or practical guidance and how you integrate that. How are you planning, as they go more into AI, to make sure that students are doing some original drafting?
So, that's an excellent question. And obviously it comes from somebody who's used to teaching. It depends on the course. If the course has a final exam, very little drafting that's involved in that. I teach two types of courses. My large courses have final exams. I don't have enough time to be able to grade 10 to 15 page papers. And most of my courses are 2, some of them are 3 credit courses. So in my large courses, final exam, we don't have papers. As far as my paper courses, that is a hard one. There are programs. So I'm sure many of you up until now have been using plagiarism checking programs for papers that are submitted to you. There are programs now, that are trying to address AI and trying to address original content as far as the AI section is concerned. I don't have a simple answer to that, and I don't know what the true answer will be, except for, it is always, I think, going to be difficult for us as professors to be able to determine whether the student is submitting to us original work, putting aside plagiarism, as opposed to letting, the computer draft their work product.
Thank you. I think we're all a little in the dark there, and I'm just going to say that at least one court has also cited somebody for plagiarism in a brief. I'm not talking about false cases. I'm just saying, it's going to be a brave new world out there, and all of us are kind of a little in the dark. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Anyone else? Margaret?
If you grade the student performance and you are operating with a subset of the class, volunteers, does that grade constitute extra credit, or how does it get figured into your final analysis?
Yeah, and I grappled with that in the beginning, but I'll tell you how I grade generally. So typically, I'm telling my students the first night of class, and it's on my syllabus, and it's on the coursework, whether we're using Canvas or Blackboard, that participation matters, and it could increase their grade or reduce their grade. And every once in a while, I have a student that gives me an A on a final exam, and they're getting an A- in the course because, as you know, some of us are subject to a mandatory curve, and the ones that participate should benefit. Specific answer to your question, it's a bump up. I'm asking, especially in the large classes, I'm asking for volunteers. So I guess I could liken that to, this is another level of participation. So they just get extra points for that.
Anyone else? I think there are no more questions. So thank you, Richard, for that presentation. And I think we're wrapping up for today.
Okay, Elmer, I can't hear you if you're talking.
Sorry, let me get closer to the mic. Yeah. Thank you, Richard, for the presentation, and we're going to wrap up for the day. Since there are no more questions.
Okay, nothing online.
Yep. No, nothing online.
Okay, all right, thank you. I hope everybody learned something.
Thanks.